Hi guys. So I guess we could go ahead and get started with the topic analysis. Well, okay. So we'll just be going over the September-October 24 living wage topic for the LD season. So before we get into it, just a little overview on who we are. My name is Meera. Hold up, let me turn on my camera because this is awkward. Um, and I'm going to be a rising junior at Ridge High School in New Jersey. I'm the captain of my school's LD team, and this will be my third year of doing LD, my second year of doing like circuit style LD, and I've won Pennsbury, reached elims at a bunch of like national tournaments, qualified for the NSDA, and reached elims of the NCFL. I really like reading the Cap K and reach out to me if you are an aspiring communist.
Hi, I'm Felicity. I'm a rising senior at Concord-Carlisle High School in Massachusetts. I've been competing in debate for around 3 years and in LD for around two. So as the first LD debater from my school, I've won the Massachusetts State Championship last year, and I've also qualified for the TOC and NSDA, and I've also gotten a lot of elimination finishes in circuit tournaments. And I didn't write this on the slide, but my favorite arguments are the Setcol K, the feminist economics K, and policy. So I'm also really excited to be doing this lecture for all of you guys and to work with other debaters throughout this year. All right, so we're going to start with going over some definitions on the living wage topic. So the text of the resolution for this topic is resolved the United States ought to require that workers receive a living wage. So we'll start by defining the United States is probably most likely going to be defined as the United States federal government. But the way that a living wage is likely going to work is that because it's a flexible wage that depends on the standards of living, the cost of living in a particular area, that even if the resolution itself is a policy passed by the federal government, that it is often going to be up to individual states to enforce it and to kind of engage in specific analyses of, for example, how much the living wage should be in their specific state. So that probably still means that the state's counterplan does compete, though, because you're still, even if it's up to states to decide the specifics of the living wage policy, it's still going to be an overall federally enforced piece of legislation that probably goes through like Congress, or maybe you can do like an executive order or something. That normal mean stuff is probably up to debate. The next word, require, usually indicates that there's going to be some sort of legislation, as I was just talking about, as opposed to other terms. For example, the United States ought to like, or I'm not actually sure which other words, but the require specifically probably indicates legal language. Also, for workers, this is going to be the subject of a lot of tea debates, I expect, whether or not there are exceptions to workers. And we'll talk about Nebel tea a little bit later. But whether you're talking about every worker in the United States, whether you're talking about maybe part-time workers, and whether or not you're including volunteers or employees in how you define a worker. And last is living wage itself. So you can see on the right, the Global Living Wage Coalition describes it as the remuneration by a worker in a particular place to afford a decent standard of living for the worker and his or her family, which includes elements like food, water, housing, education, healthcare, transportation, clothing, etc. So obviously, the living wage is not going to earmark any funds and say that you can only use your living wage to purchase these elements, but the purpose of the living wage is to ensure that everyone can afford these basic necessities. The way that the living wage is calculated may vary based on different circumstances, because the point is that it's supposed to be flexible as opposed to the minimum wage, which usually doesn't change unless you like negotiate it. But the living wage is meant to adapt based on circumstances such as inflation, when these costs of fundamental elements like food, water, housing, etc. Change. The MIT Living Wage Calculator is probably one of the most common tools that's a lot of debaters are likely going to reference. And you can see the card there at the bottom. I think Meera cut from the MIT Living Wage website and information that gives a very similar definition talking about how the living wage is supposed to ensure these basic needs. The living wage calculator has some more specifics about like specific amounts, estimates for what the living wage would need to be in certain areas and states. So I encourage you guys to check that out later so you guys can start to understand maybe how much more it is than the minimum wage.
Cool. So let's move on to some background and history of the living wage. So, first is that there isn't really a current living wage implemented in the world. England has a voluntary living wage, so it doesn't really operate the same because a lot of companies and major corporations have opted out of it, which means that it's not really providing an adequate standard of living. But obviously, some companies are giving this. In terms of the United States, right now we have a federal minimum wage of $7.25. Of course, the difference between a living wage and a minimum wage is that a minimum wage is just what the federal government is requiring that all companies must pay their workers, versus a living wage actually should provide these basic needs. MIT, the living wage calculator, says that an average living wage should be $25.02 for a family of four. So obviously, you can see that the wages and the floor for what a wage is going to look like is going to go up significantly, considering this is like $20 higher. Yeah, and it's also going to be calculated based on state expenses. Obviously, certain states, California, New Jersey, have much higher much higher state minimum wages, but the living wage everywhere is just going to increase. Enforcement is going to look through like the Department of Labor. That's what enforces the minimum wage right now and kind of enforces just general labor laws, things like that. And there's still going to be like negotiations through unions, etc. A couple other examples you might want to look into. One would be at San Francisco airport. After workers started fighting to have like better conditions and wages, they raised their minimum wage to $20.72. Obviously, this isn't technically a living wage, but it provided for a much better standard of living, and I think that's something to look into. But more significantly and more enforced was the California rise in minimum wage, where they basically raised their minimum wage so to provide a better life for restaurant workers. However, this actually had a much more negative than positive effect. A couple reasons. One, a lot of companies started firing workers because they couldn't afford to have this many and they couldn't afford to pay this much. And second, inflation kind of went up. What happened is that food prices just went up significantly. So all these businesses, especially small businesses, lost a significant amount of money. We'll go into this more when we talk about like disads and the neg positions, but just kind of talking about these examples and assuming that California is one of the biggest examples in the United States, it's going to be really important when you're talking about solvency. In terms of debate history, if you want to do some wiki stalking, you can look at the LD Jan-Feb 2014 to 2015 wiki. It was a living wage. The wording of the resolution was a bit different, but you can still look to common disads. And the 23-24 high school policy topic was a universal basic income. So if you're looking to like critiques on the negative, KFs, etc., you can find a lot of relevant literature. Okay, some important questions that kind of come up as soon as we start looking at the background, history, and definitions. You can kind of unmute if you have any specific questions or kind of put them in the chat, but just things to consider when you're constructing your affirmative position. Okay, the first is going to be a cycle of inflation. What happens so a living wage is calculated based off the average standard of living in a certain place, i.e., in order for me to live in like New Jersey and afford basic necessities like food, water, education, I need to pay XYZ amount of money. Now, if my wages go up, that then causes the price of goods to go up, which then causes the standard of living to go up, which then theoretically would also cause my wages to have to go up again, which then kind of brings the question of how would this actually work? And if the prices of goods go up as a result of higher wages, just as it did in California, when is the point at which we stop? The second question is the fact that like a living wage completely contradicts capitalist logics. Capitalism is kind of based off this idea of surplus value and that we always need to extract profit by exploiting workers and making sure they don't get like the full value of their work and that there's always some sort of profit. However, when you raise a living wage, your profit margin goes down significantly. This raises the question of how are companies going to adapt and how is this going to get around like political barriers, for example. The third thing is going to be calculations. Felicity talked a lot about like the MIT living wage calculator, and there are ways to calculate it. But then the question becomes, well, would people move to places with a better standard of living, i.e., some communities across the United States have a better source of education and housing, like basic housing prices are a lot more expensive. Does that mean people are all going to move to those places because they know they're guaranteed a standards living wage? Then the next question is, will only one family member work? What happens with the living wage is that it's calculated based on the number of dependents you have. However, if you're kind of in a if you're married and one spouse or both spouses are working, the living wage is a lot lower than if you're married and only one spouse is working, because then your second spouse is considered a dependent. So this kind of disincentivizes people from like having both parents being working. Then there's a question of, does it apply internationally? The kind of more logical answer is yes, because companies, international companies, and more so companies that are like US based, i.e., like Apple, kind of hiring people in the global south, would it apply there? A lot of the major question is going to be like, a lot of people are going to say yes, but there's also the question of how is it going to be enforced? There's a lot of loopholes in labor regulation when it comes to overseas things. You can look at things like the fact that the US has like child slaves in the Congo or exploits workers in the global south.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some LARP AFs. For those of you who might not be familiar with the term LARP, it's just like policy style arguments, usually with like big stick extinction impacts. So wait, Meera, are you able to go to the next slide? Okay, great, thanks. Cool. So first for whole res AFs that aren't going to specify based on workers or maybe categories of workers, the most common advantage is probably just going to be the economy. This is a very stock argument. If you increase disposable income, that also increases consumer spending, which increases overall demand, which is what Meera was saying earlier, and that leads to economic growth. But there's also a couple of other internal links. You can also have, for example, increasing worker satisfaction overall. There's a lot of evidence that talks about worker burnout and worker productivity as a result of low wages. Maybe there isn't like incentive for these workers to be doing as much and being as productive at their jobs because they think that they're being unfairly compensated. That's also leading to high turnover rates, which increases costs for businesses. Turnover rates are essentially when a lot of people are dissatisfied with their jobs and they're leaving, then these businesses are going to be constantly engaging in processes of firing, hiring, recruiting, etc., which obviously will increase the cost for them to kind of keep up and make sure that they still have a workforce that is able to meet the business's needs. So the idea is that a living wage would help combat that kind of worker satisfaction, help increase worker satisfaction, which would lead to increased productivity, decreased turnover rates, and improve the economy overall. Also, there's reducing poverty and inequality. This may be more of a soft left type argument, which Meera is going to talk about in a little bit, but it could also just be another internal link to the economy advantage as another way that you can say have better economic resilience, resist economic shocks. The impacts, obviously, the economy, economic decline, recessions. Just a note that if you are cutting or reading the economy advantage, you want to make sure that your impact card probably accounts for a lot of recent trends in, for example, there's a lot of thumpers for like the COVID recession and other factors. So make sure that if you're doing any economy arguments, your evidence always has to be really recent, or you have to be able to explain how like current trends in inflation, et cetera, are accounted for by your evidence. The second main advantage that I'm not sure exactly how common this one has been at camps that did this topic, but there's international law. So the UN doesn't, although there isn't a body of international law that explicitly says that we need to implement or countries ought to implement a living wage, there are, the UN does say that, for example, poverty, the UN says that we should combat poverty and also that people need to have an adequate standard of living. So there could be offense for why the US should be an international leader in meeting those SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals under the UN, and increasing like multilateralism, international cooperation overall to solve like a host of global threats. Next, we'll move on to plan-AFs. So if you're planning on speccing, the most common form of speccing is probably going to be based on sectors. Or you could also do like groups of workers, which we aren't going to get into that much here, but that, for example, could be based on like workers' ability, maybe their gender, other forms of their identity. But more common is probably going to be these sector-based apps. For example, we'll probably see a lot of green tech and renewables industry apps that are focusing on that might have like a climate change impact, that giving people in these sectors a living wage will encourage more. Yeah, the thesis of all of these plan apps is essentially that giving people a living wage in these areas encourages more workers, which creates like a host of benefits specific to that industry. For example, the green tech one is climate change. For education, that would be teachers, and you could have some sort of like innovation or development related impact. The military app is actually pretty interesting because there's evidence that says that like competitive wages incentivize more people to join the military, especially in the world's current state of like geopolitical tension. This could be really important for a kind of preventing global war or ensuring US readiness type thing. And the other two other common industries are agriculture and manufacturing, that also probably would fall into the lines of more like economic based impacts, as opposed to maybe like the other three that have more like specific sector based impacts. But those are probably also still going to be pretty common plan apps there. Cool.
Yeah, sorry for switching the slide early, but we'll get into chaos, which are probably my favorite on the topic because there is so much ground and there are so many things you can read, because the core of a living wage is obviously kind of providing people with an adequate standard of living, which a lot of people just don't get. So let's get into that. So the first kind of soft left app I think we could potentially see on this topic is colonialism. This is the one I'm probably the most hesitant about because obviously it's still like the affirmative doesn't get rid of US intervention or end colonialism anywhere, which makes the reform versus revolution debate a little complicated. But if you kind of have a good framework, you could run this. The example of colonialism I was thinking of would be in the global South. Currently, the US exploits a ton of workers in the global South. We employ child slaves, etc. A living wage would help ensure a better standard of living, would allow these workers to actually like live on more than $1 a day, and would prevent huge amounts of exploitation. The second thing on this topic would be racial cap. I think you could go two paths with this. One would be reform, where you just talk about how like racial capitalism leads to lower wages, or how lower wages are a result of racial cap, and how this uniquely leads to exploitation of certain minorities, i.e. Black people, and how the affirmative helps rectify this. The second path you could take is going revolution based, where you say, okay, capitalism has created exploitative conditions, which has prevented workers from being able to create change. Providing a living wage allows workers to now rise up and have more power in the companies, which allows a revolution. I do think the like link chain for a revolution is really, really tough to win. It's hard to win, kind of spillover evidence. Obviously, regardless of whether you run reform or revolution, you want to have evidence in your framing section about how a living wage is uniquely good to combat capitalism, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be enough to fiat that a whole revolution is going to occur and that you're able to overthrow capitalism. So rather than reading a huge theory of power where it's like, oh, capitalism is destroying the world and causing climate change, you might want to just go for like a more mix of a like racial cap plus like just talking about like minorities and how they are exploited and how a living wage helps rectify that. Other soft left would be just focusing on any other minorities. I think a FEMAF on this topic would be really good and also really important to talk about. Two kind of warrants. One is the fact that a lot of women are obviously paid way less than men in the workforce, and women hold the majority of low-paying jobs in the United States currently, so a living wage helps with that. The impact could be some sort of domestic violence impact, because a lot of times women are forced to stay in abusive relationships due to financial reasons and are not able to escape it, and having a living wage would allow them to escape that and allow them to get a lot of times like get out of like homeless shelters, which oftentimes lead to higher amounts of domestic violence. The next thing could be an anti-blackness app where you talk about how like Black people are uniquely impacted by lower wages. I think could be combined with racial cap, so it would just make overall would have a really good offense. The last app I was thinking about that isn't on this slide, but you could talk about it, would be like a prisoners app. it would be a little weird, and I haven't done a ton of research into the literature, but prisoners aren't really paid enough, and a lot of times they're barely able to access basic necessities like toothbrushes. So providing them with a living wage would allow them to just have a better standard of living, and you could have some sort of like rehabilitation or decreasing crime impact. Obviously, you'd have to win that prisoners count under the definition of a quote worker, or because a lot of times a living wage will specify that it should be a full-time worker, so you need to be careful with that. But overarchingly, lots of soft left ground on this. You're probably going to be going the reform path and kind of talking about how a living wage would help different minorities. Oh, okay. Next thing, I forgot this was on here. Okay, non-TFs. Okay, so first you have your classical kind of just identity apps, reinterpretations of the topic, critiques of the topic. I'm not going to go too in depth into those. I think if you're kind of really passionate about reading identity apps, I would recommend reading a lot of literature around the app that you want to read. Felicity, I can see you laughing at me for messing up.
I'm
Literature.
not laughing, don't worry.
Okay, okay. Literature about what you want to read, specifically kind of looking through a lot of past apps, but kind of more specific to the topic, I could see a CAP app. This is a little bit of a weird strat. One, because there is a strong TVA about how a living wage can combat racial capitalism and can help make workers stronger. But there are also a lot of capitalist critiques of a living wage in two retrospects. One is the fact that it tends to be a form of pacifying the workers, where we're like, oh, here, let's just give more to the workers so they don't stand up against the working class. And second, it tends to be like a piecemeal reform where we're like, okay, we're going to ignore the fact that capitalism like exploits surplus value and exploits workers and is based on this, but let's just give people wages. The third kind of warrant for a cap app would be things like, oh, a living wage and capitalism are fundamentally incompatible. This would look very similar to the cap K on the neg, but then in the T debates, you would be just going for why or I guess on the T debates, you'd be just talking about why capitalism and the living wage are fundamentally incompatible and why they can't exist together. The third thing I think would be pretty cool on this topic would be a feminist reinterpretation of the topic. A lot of times, traditional conceptions of what a worker is and the definition of a worker oftentimes exclude women who like work at home, for example. There's this thing known as the second shift, where it's like women after they work a first shift at work, and like what is classified as normative work. So like where you're earning a salary, they have to go home and take care of the house, take care of children, and this is considered the second shift. And it's also a like way of work. I don't really know how you would provide like a living wage per se, or how you would redefine the living wage, but I think it would be really cool to redefine the definition of workers and talk about a better standard of living for women writ large. Cool. Phil asks, this is my probably like weakest point in general, but I do think it would be really cool on this topic, and a lot of Phil people are like very passionate about this topic from what I heard. But let's get into it. So first is Kant. Kant actually tends to negate on this topic, which is a little surprising, but we'll get to that later. If you do want to run on Kant AF, there are a couple things you can run. First is the fact that poverty prevents people from being able to like exercise their economic will, and prevents them from being able to participate in the omnilateral will or the social contract. This is definitely a really good strat, but it's a little wonky because a lot of Kant frameworks in debate don't actually go into the fact, like go into justifying social contract as a form of Kant. So it's like doesn't always become the most like it becomes a little hard to understand. Then is the second thing is that state has a perfect duty to support the poor, and that like a living wage would inherently help this. And third would be just like a non-universalizable warrant. I do think this is a really hard argument to make, but you can definitely go for the fact that like not providing a living wage is like makes it so that you're like is unable to be universalized because it prevents you from being able to like reap the benefits. But then that just kind of goes back into this whole idea of not being able to exercise your economic will. So I definitely don't think it's the best argument to make on this topic. Second is going to be Hegel. This I do think is a lot stronger. The whole argument is that workers' consciousness are not being recognized and their dialectic cannot be forwarded. Hegel basically has this whole theory of the dialectic and how in order to kind of structure society, people must inherently be able to like forward their dialectic or their kind of inherent self sense of self. What it says is that poverty and kind of lack of a living wage prevents you from being able to achieve this, and means that like employers aren't actually recognizing workers as agents, which means that they're not able to like move forward. Their dialectic isn't able able to be forwarded, which kind of would mean that a living wage helps rectify this, then you can just make arguments about agency and autonomy and how a living wage is key to achieving like either of those, and how people without a living wage are unable to exercise agency or autonomy. The next thing would be marks as a PhilAF. This is a little weird. And it would be obviously distinct from a KF, and it wouldn't be really consequentialist as a KF would be, but you would go for this idea of like constitutivism and how you should be able to appropriate the world. What this means is that you need to, like, workers have an inherent right to be able to act in their sense of self, and being in poverty prevents that from being able to take place and prevents you from being able to act in your sense of self. And the second thing I think you can make a constitutivism argument is just about like workers kind of reaping the benefits of their labor. I do think this is a little weird to make because you could just make the argument that that kind of rejects the capitalist system writ large and would probably be more of a turn rather than a reason for why it affirms, but you could still probably try to make the argument. The next thing is going to be Butler. Butler basically has this argument about how certain lives are grievable versus others aren't considered as grievable. What this means is that, I guess in the like more basic sense, what this means is that in society, certain people aren't really viewed as kind of people and aren't like therefore they're not viewed as their lives being grievable. A lot of times you'll see this more often as people making a root cause claim on a critique like set call, like the reason colonialism exists is because certain lives aren't grievable. But the argument you would make on the PhilAF is that poverty makes it so that certain lives aren't kind of grievable. You could also work this into sort of like a KF type thing about how like certain racial minorities aren't considered, like their lives aren't considered grievable, and a living wage helps achieve that. Though I think that would lose to some sort of like PES argument or a material critique. Okay, the next sort of Phil stuff is going to be polls and intuitions. Polls, intuitions is sometimes a little weird of an argument to run in general, but what it basically says is that, oh, people say we should do this, we should do it. I.e., like, oh, the vast majority of people in the United States agree with a living wage, thus we should implement a living wage. It'll make the argument that it's intuitively good to give a living wage. It's a little hard to win this framework, but you're going to be able to win the offense, so you're just going to have to make sure you're very strong on a framework. The next thing is going to be virtue ethics. Virtue ethics, again, is a little bit of a weird framework. It basically says, oh, we should do whatever is virtuous. There's not a clear definition of what is a virtue. Like they don't tell you, oh, care is a virtue versus something else isn't virtue. There are kind of like pragmatic definitions of what a virtue constitutes, like being able to exercise your will while also others being able to exercise their will. But it boils down to the idea that hard work is a virtue, and poverty prevent or kind of lack of a living wage makes it so that people aren't able to get the benefits of their hard work. And second is that kind of allowing people to have a living wage allows them to complete some sort of virtuous action and get ahead, which means that like it would affirm under this. The next thing is Pettit. Again, Pettit says like we should value freedom as non-domination. What this means is it says that like people shouldn't be able to interfere in your way of freedom. This is a little weird because it might seem like, oh, shouldn't wages kind of negate on this? But it's the whole idea that like a lack of a living wage infringes on the autonomy of people, and like even if it's not like actively occurring where people are being like, hey, you can't do this, inherently being in poverty and not having a living wage means that you're not going to be, it means that you're not able to exercise your autonomy. Basically, when it comes down to all these field frameworks, one of the biggest things that you do need to win is that kind of combating poverty is inherent to a living wage. Remember, you can't really make the consequentialist argument that like, oh, a living wage will combat poverty, but rather that a living wage combats poverty. I'm sorry if some of these explanations of the frameworks were kind of butchered. I'm not a Phil debater, but like this kind of, if you're interested in any of this literature, I would highly recommend looking into it. Oh wait, I'm also doing layoffs. Holy, I'm talking for a lot. Okay. Whoa. Okay. Layoffs. Whoa. For the traditional circuit. Also, Yale has a lot of trad judges, so I think this is really important for you guys to keep in mind, because who knows, you're going to end up in like semifinals with the lay panel, and you're like, oh no, I have to spread like a Hegel laugh. Okay. So layoffs. Criteria. So for your value criterion, yes, we love those. Roles, veil of ignorance, structural violence, social justice, autonomy, dignity, human rights. Kind of everything I was talking about with the Phil and the like soft left apps about how poverty, bad. It means that people aren't able to move forward in society. It uniquely hurts racial minorities. We're able to fix that. Woo. Perfect case. Parents will love that. They'll eat it up. Great. Okay. But you could also go util. It's a little less strategic. I don't know many like trad judges who are going to buy the fact that like an economic decline is going to lead to a nuclear war. I do think, however, they will buy that, oh, economic decline perpetuates structural inequalities. So you could still read the exact same LARP advantages Felicity was talking about with econ and I law and talk about, oh, hey, this is able to allow for better human rights, allow to rectify structural violence. Alternatively, you could just talk about like racial minorities and layify any of the KAFs we were talking about before. Okay, neg positions.
Okay. I'm covering the LARP policy stuff again. So first we'll talk about some common disads on this topic. Um, Meera already previewed some of these arguments earlier in the important questions thing. Meera, do you want to move to the next slide? Thanks. Okay.
Whoops.
Um, yeah, so Meera already previewed some of these arguments, especially the economy-based disads. The most common econ-based disad is honestly all of these disads are a little bit similar because they're fundamentally all going to have some sort of economic internal link and economic impact that says like, oh, the living wage harms the economy in some way, that's bad, causes recession, collapse of the economy, that's bad for XYZ reasons. The most common disad probably is going to be the inflation disad, which is a little bit of what Meera was talking about earlier. So specifically, there's a term called the wage price inflation spiral, which is basically the idea that when you, or I think Meera also mentioned this earlier, when you increase workers' wages, that means that you have to pay them more for like producing goods, since workers are still responsible for like producing the kind of goods that are going to be manufactured and sold to the general public, which means that when you increase wages, you're also increasing the production costs for these goods, which means that those increased production costs get passed on to consumers, and those consumers are largely going to be the workers whose wages increased, but now they still can't afford it. Because the cost of these goods also increased from production costs, which leads to this kind of spiral that supposedly is just going to continue. There's some evidence about economic modeling that says that this is going to happen, but you can also probably try to explain, if you're on the AF and trying to answer this argument, like reasonably how much is this spiral going to continue forever and ever? Like, is it always going to be that these goods are always going to end up just out of reach of like the ability of workers to pay? But yeah, inflation will then be the most common disad. Then there's also the small businesses disad, which also kind of overlaps with a general kind of employment disad. So even though on the definitions page I was talking about how the living wage is probably a policy implemented by the federal government, even if it's implemented by the federal government, that doesn't mean it's the federal government that's actually in charge of paying every single worker's living wage. That's still going to be based on each worker's individual employer, which obviously poses problems for example, small businesses that might not be able to afford, that might not just have enough revenue to be able to increase all of their workers' wages as dramatically as Meera was mentioning with like the MIT living wage calculator. Which would cause things like small business shutdown. There's a lot of good evidence about why small businesses are the backbone of the economy. Also, just generally employment, not even small businesses, but just generally when companies have to pay all of their workers more money, they might either try to find loopholes or they're just going to lay off a bunch of workers to cut costs as much as they can. Next is the offshoring disad, which is, so the offshoring disad is, you guys might be familiar with it if you did I think it was last year's NovDeck topic on fossil fuel extraction. There was a similar argument, which basically says that when companies feel that they have to pay more money, they're going to move to other countries to avoid having to pay the living wage because we're only implementing it on domestic-based companies. So the idea is these companies move to places with worse environmental and economic regulations, which leads to greater overall exploitation and also decreases the revenue of the US because these companies are no longer funneling money back into the US economy if they're literally operating out of another country. The problem though is also that this still means that like domestic competition still exists because they're just importing the goods that they've produced back into the US, which means domestic US workers are still going to like have to compete with these same companies, except these companies just aren't subject to US regulations anymore. Next, there's the trade-off disad. This honestly might be more strategic against soft left disads. I'm not sure how well of an actual like a big stick econ recession type impact it has, but the argument here is that the difference between hand out and hand up welfare programs is that hand out programs such as SNAP and Medicare are when the government is providing you with some amount of aid so that you can try to get a better standard of living for yourself. But hand up programs like living wage is the government is directly like placing you and placing every worker at a higher level. The idea is that when the government is using a living wage, they will think that there's like less need for these kind of hand out welfare programs, which decreases things like SNAP and Medicare, and probably means that a lot of these minority groups that these minority groups that still need access to these kind of additional support systems might lose some of those systems because the government thinks that like the living wage is sufficient to kind of address those issues. There are also obviously super generic disads that apply on every topic. Make sure that your internal links are really specific to raising and instituting a living wage. There's a lot of evidence about like raising the minimum wage that probably works too, but there's going to be a lot of evidence comparison on this topic about whether your evidence is specific to slight increases in the minimum wage versus a drastic increase in the living wage that is probably like fourfold or something like that. That definitely applies, especially for the econ-based disads. Also, yeah, the generic disads. So you can have agenda politics, which is like when the US passes, or agenda politics, like when the US passes or when you fiat the plan, when the US passes this, that the US is not going to be able to pass other needed legislation, such as like I think the Farm Bill disad is coming back. Also the elections disad that passing the living wage now either like helps Harris or helps the Democrats or helps the Republicans, which is either good or bad depending on like what impact module you want to read. Also the court clog disad that this honestly might be the court clog disad usually isn't great because there's a lot of arguments for why like even like courts are still functioning even if there's an increased load of cases. But the thing with living wage is that if the AF evidence isn't super specific about like the specific way that you're going to be implementing, calculating the living wage, etc., you probably realistically will see a lot of increased lawsuits and lawsuits that are going to kind of maybe make courts' jobs harder to do. The impacts for the court clog disad, I won't go too much in detail because I don't think this is the best disad, but could be like anything from like, oh, the courts should be focusing on like other things like environmental or technological regulation, but the plan kind of trades off. It's a little bit similar to agenda politics, except specific to the courts and an overload of cases because the plan is not clear enough or because of some other issue with the plan. There are also sector-specific disads. For example, the agriculture disad. This is a little bit similar to also probably like I think I'll talk about small businesses or yeah, the small businesses disad that I was mentioning earlier. Same general idea. Basically, certain sectors maybe you don't want to have a living wage in those sectors because it is going to kind of weaken the sector's ability to like or yeah, for agriculture specifically, it's that you would it's like a mix of the inflation disad too, because it would increase things like food costs, specifically, which yeah, food instability also, yeah, but a bit similar to the econ-based disads.
Yeah, there's also a warrant that like increased food costs lead to food wars. It's a little like wonky of an argument, but especially in the world of the affirmative, you can assume that there's going to be extreme amounts of inflation, considering you're increasing the floor from wages by nearly like 3 times.
Mhm. Okay, next on counterplans. Oops, sorry, I just kicked something. I don't know what. Um, So first we see the generic like process or agent counter plans where you just do the AF but through like a different process, or you have a different actor that's not the US federal government or however the AF defines it. Again, if you're going to read one of these counter plans, you should probably ask in cross-ex what normal means is, what the AF defends is, like who is doing the minimum wage, how is it implemented, to make sure that you can generate competition for these counter plans. But the state's counterplan, which is what I was mentioning earlier, instead of having like the USFG mandate or pass this federal piece of legislation saying that we should have a living wage, that states should just do it individually. Potentially the executive order counterplan, which is just if the AF defends like maybe congressional legislation, but I'm not really sure. Honestly, I was talking to some people and we are not sure how constitutional it would be to pass a living wage as an executive order. So that is definitely something to look into. Also, the RegNeg counterplan and other forms of consult counterplans. RegNeg is basically like you gather the stakeholders like probably companies, also the government, employers, employees, etc. And then they like deliberate over whether the plan is a good idea before they pass it. And usually the net benefit is going to be some form of like politics or like business confidence disad. But again, this competition here where depends on defining the word require versus like negotiate, etc. And if the plan is like immediate, yeah, that's a little bit in the weeds of like counterplan competition, but also sector specific picks. So we talked a little bit about sector disads on the previous slide. So this is just like probably an easier way or a more potentially more strategic way to do sector disads. For example, the agriculture one, you can just say we should implement the living wage everywhere except for in a specific sector that avoids like the food prices, food wars scenario from agriculture, for example. Also, this topic is interesting because it's a very specific economic policy aimed at like welfare type stuff, but there are also a lot of other forms of welfare. And these kind of economic based policies that means that a lot of AF advantages, especially like econ based advantages or inequality advantages, are going to be may solve like most, if not all, of the affirmative. So specifically the UBI, the Universal Basic Income counterplan. So the reason that this competes is because the living wage still requires you to work, but a universal basic income is where the government gives you money, essentially like a certain amount of money per a certain amount of time. Um, and not dependent on like the specific way that we talked about a living wage being calculated earlier. The federal jobs guarantee counterplan basically give everyone a job, and also a counterplan to do stuff like decrease taxes. Uh, yeah, I see a question. Meera, do you think we have time to just answer questions right now, or do we want to wait until? Okay, cool. Yeah. What's your question?
I was just wondering for UBI and federal jobs guarantee, like what would be the net benefit for the counter plan, like over uh living wage?
Yeah, so I think the most likely net benefits are probably going to be something along the lines of like one of the econ disads potentially, or one of the sector-based disads. I think to be honest, there is definitely like the question of what like then I think the net benefits on these advantage counterplans are the sketchiest part of them. But I think that might also be like based they might be more strategic against like sector apps potentially. Wait, Meera, do you want to add?
Can I add something? Yeah. So I think the federal jobs guarantee counterplan solves for the unemployment decide because there's a huge argument that like, oh, when you increase a living wage, companies are going to fire a ton of people. Specific like because they're not able to afford having this many employees. So just giving a federal jobs guarantee solves back for that. The universal basic income counterplan, the UBI is provided by the government rather than like companies themselves, which could solve back for exactly what Felicity was talking about.
Yeah, and also they could potentially solve some process-based disads like politics, agenda politics, etc.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I get your guys' advice on something that I've been working on for my case?
Yeah. Do you mind holding until like we finish the main part of the lecture? We'll do the
Sure.
Q&A part
Okay.
after. Okay, great. Thank you. Cool. Mira, I think we're good with this slide. Or are you doing case? Cool.
Yep. Okay, let's move on to critiques. So I think there's definitely a lot of K ground on this topic, and they will be particularly strategic against a lot of soft left AFs because you can make a lot of like, oh, alt selves case arguments, and I think there's going to be a lot of big schools reading K AFs, cough, cough, Harrison. Okay, so the cap K. So we were kind of talking about a non-T cap AF before, but there are a couple links to the cap K. First, it would critique the ideas of workers in the first place. There are a lot of literature out there about how we conceive of a worker is oftentimes due to their productivity, which tends to kind of like be a capitalist notion of work. Second would be what productivity is. A lot of affirmatives might have a like idea of productivity, i.e., they might mention productivity specifically in the affirmative about how increased wages might increase that, and you can kind of critique the idea of what productivity means in the first place. Then there's also a capitalist critique of the idea of wages in the first place. They explain that wages are kind of a way of commodifying labor, and that in itself is inherently bad. Then the next argument you can make is that a living wage isn't possible under capitalism, and that the affirmative is just a way of trying to pacify workers, and it's just a method of capitalist propaganda. If you remember from the kind of common questions section we were talking about before, we were kind of talking about how, oh, a living wage contradicts how capitalism works, and that capitalists will always just want to automate and make more profit, which means at the end of the day, workers are never actually going to make enough money to sustain themselves, and they're always going to be exploited. So that's the argument of the cap K. Then would be the fem K, specifically, I think would be like a feminist economics K. Similar to the feminist reinterpretation of the topic that we were talking about before, I think you can critique the idea of what a worker is. A lot of times women aren't considered workers, especially with like stay-at-home moms or childcare, etc. That isn't considered work. And the idea of only giving money for what is considered productive work in the actual sector is oftentimes something that a lot of feminist authors will critique. Next is going to be the set call K. Similar to the fem K, it's this idea of workers and productivity. A lot of times, well, actually, there's a lot of literature out there talking about how colonists don't consider indigenous people as workers, and they don't view them as productive, and they don't view indigenous ways of life as productive or good, and then use that to devalue them. I think that can be an independent link in itself. The second thing that I've actually seen is the conception of wealth in itself. So a lot of apps will reference the idea of wealth and making money and living wage as a way of doing that. However, there are literature out there that basically says that our conception of wealth is like completely screwed up and colonialist, and it should kind of like, and trying to expand wealth is just an expansion of colonialist logics. They'll make the argument that wealth is actually kind of land-based, as a lot of indigenous kind of authors will agree with, and just kind of critique the idea of what it means to be wealthy in the first place. Then there's biopolitics. I haven't honestly read too much into how biopolitics would function in this topic, but I do think that similar, like a lot of times biopolitics, necropolitics, they're just a critique of state power. If you are unfamiliar with biopolitics and necropolitics, they basically talk about state power and how the power has the ability to control people without people kind of constantly being aware of it. And in the context of necropolitics, it basically says that the state kind of reduces us to a state of the living dead where we don't actually have any autonomy. The whole idea would just kind of critique the state, and you could probably say that a living wage is an expansion of this. The last critique I think would be really good on this topic would be an idea of semiocap. Berardi's Soul at Work talks about this idea of how capitalists have basically employed not just our labor and have not only commodified our labor, but that have also taken kind of like a part of our soul in essence, or have taken kind of commodify us as beings. And a lot of alts relating to semiocap basically say that the way to fix capitalism is to sit back, not work at all, and as a result, the entire capitalist system will collapse and it solves all the impacts. So I think you can make a critique of the idea of work in itself. Okay. Next is going to be topicality with the side of theory. So Theory, I think, is going to be great to run on this topic. I think you're going to be able to get a ton of ground in terms of spec shells. Why? Because a lot of people aren't be able to define exactly what a living wage is. They're not going to be able to tell you how it's going enforced, and they're going to forget to include something like, oh, what are the basic needs? And I think if you write out a really clear spec shell with like 4 things that the affirmative needs to specify, i.e., what are the basic needs, who is it implemented on, how is this enforced, and where does the money that is used to enforce a living wage even come from? That could construct a really good spec shell, and you could get a lot of offense off of this. With that note, please everyone make sure to remember put really good solvency advocates in your AF so you don't lose to spec, because a lot more judges, I think now, are willing to vote on it. Okay, then let's move on to topicality. If you're unfamiliar with what topicality is, it's just the argument of that the affirmative does not follow its resolutional burden and does not actually defend the topic in itself, which obviously is bad and leads to ground violations, makes it impossible for the neg to fulfill its burden in the debate. So the first argument would be T workers. I don't know if this is the most convincing shell because I don't think it has the most amount of offense, but it makes the argument that, oh, the affirmative doesn't really defend all workers. For example, they might say that, oh, you must defend all workers or your conception of a worker is wrong. Then there's subsets plus T, which is just the argument that like you should be able to like specify a certain sector. I think a lot of affirmatives are going to be specifying sectors, so you can just make the argument that it's bad to specify. That makes it impossible to negate. You're not able to get access to disads, counterplans, etc. The next thing is that people might actually use T to get counterplan competition. So one thing you'll notice is that the definition, the topic says require, and they'll run T and say like, oh, the affirmative does not require a living wage. And then the affirmative will be forced into making an I meet to that T shell. They'll be like, yes, we do require it. Then what is the negative able to do? They're able to use this on any consult counterplan they have, because consult counterplans don't require the affirmative to be passed. I know this is a little confusing, but it's basically the premise that it allows them to get stronger counterplan competition and say that, oh, we consult the UN, which means that we're not actually requiring a living wage, which is fundamentally distinct from the affirmative. The next thing is going to be T living wage. That's just kind of normal. You don't follow the definition of this resolution. The way you've defended a living wage is wrong. Last is going to be, I think method T is going to be big on this topic. I think a lot of people are going to be reading soft left AFs where they try to get external offense off of their framework section, i.e. capitalism offense, colonialism offense, and you can kind of call them out for this and through reading method T. And worst case, they make an I meet and then you use it to make sure that they can't get any external offense. Okay, cool. Last section.
Okay. So I'm apparently doing the PhilNC section because Meera did the PhilAC section, even though neither of us are actually Phil debaters. So again, take this with a grain of salt, but we'll do our best to explain this. So Kant is probably the best PhilNC on this topic because Kant actually, as a framework, or at least the way that it's most commonly justified in debate, it doesn't care about positive freedom, it only cares about negative freedom. So positive freedom is basically saying like people should be, positive freedom is our freedom to be able to do things versus negative freedom, which is like our freedom from other agents interfering with like our fundamental rights. So Kant, as usually justified, actually only cares about negative freedom and our freedom from from our rights being interfered with by other agents or other individuals, which means that Kant doesn't really care about poverty as a structure, but it does care about how the affirmative would actually coerce employers by forcing them to pay a living wage. And also another note here, which I guess isn't really a Kant neg note, but if you're going against a Kant AF, it's probably more strategic actually to read one of the advantage counterplans we were talking about earlier with a util framework and util disad, because the Kant AF probably can't justify why, if both the counterplan and the AF are both able to resolve poverty, which is like the Kant AF offense, why the perm is net beneficial, which means that it's probably pretty easy if you win like a big risk of a util disad to kind of go that route with the advantage counterplan. Also, another PhilNC is contracts. contracts basically just says like when you enter into a contract with like another individual or another entity that you should avoid breaking those contracts. That's like a very, very basic way to explain the contracts framework. But contracts would negate on this topic because it would say that workers already enter into a contract with their employer, which means that implementing a living wage is violating that initial contract that already established like what their wage should be, which means that contracts actually probably opposes most, if not all, labor regulation, which is potentially problematic. But it is kind of hard to turn, at least the offense is hard to straight turn. Last is the Hobbes NC, which basically is just the generic Hobbes offense. The government is the sovereign, and the sovereign, you can't like tell what the government or the sovereign what to do, because it's up to the sovereign to kind of like do whatever as long as they're functioning to protect people from the state of nature and preserve like fundamental rights. So yeah, those are all like very, very dumbed down explanations of the Phil stuff, but hopefully that made sense. And I think that's all of the specific substantive stuff that we had. So now we can have some time for questions. And yeah.
Yes, and the slideshow will be sent out. The recording will be posted on YouTube, I think, as well as like there'll be a link. But yeah, just floor is open for questions. Put them in the chat, raise your hand, start talking. It's cool.
Yeah. Also, I apologize for some of you guys if we were going like a little fast. There's definitely a lot to cover. And yeah, Meera and I have been talking about a lot of these arguments a lot. So we probably didn't go into as much detail as we can, but.
Okay, so there's a question in the chat saying, could you explain why a perm isn't viable for a cont-aff versus a util advantage counterplan?
Okay,
I think, yeah, you want to go ahead?
Sure, yeah. So basically the reason is because the cont-aff offense is basically saying like, oh, poverty is bad because it results in like dependence, and that means that like individuals don't have autonomy essentially. But that means that if the advantage counterplan, like implementing a UBI, does the same thing, it avoids poverty, that means that there is no question of like, there's no reason that perm do both is independently better under or has independent offense within the Kant framework. If I don't know if that kind of makes sense, but essentially because both the AF and the counterplan have the same goal of making sure that people are able to have their own like individual agency autonomy and not be dependent on others through poverty, that there's no independent reason that like doing both is better. So the AF would then have to win a reason why in that case you would still presume AF, which I personally think is a little bit hard, but
Yeah,
yeah.
and if I can just add on to something, you should note that like when you make a permutation, you always need a net benefit because there's always going to be an opportunity cost to implementing both the affirmative and some other plan. So if the neg just wins that there's no if the AF just wins that there's no net benefit, then there's literally no point like doing the perm is bad because oh it costs extra money, blah blah blah.
Okay, can I ask my question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. So, I was kind of looking into writing a case that talks about like people that are below the poverty line and whether they're below the poverty line, like, the living wage would come into place, like the requirement would come into place once someone has spent like a year or 2 years, like actively trying to, make a living wage. You know what I mean? Like, they're under the poverty line for like a year and they've been actively trying to like get a job and they can't get one, that's when the living wage requirement comes into place. If they have like a minimum wage job and they can't keep afloat. So I'm new to prog debate. Would that be a counter plan, or should I just do like a trad case with the contentions and then like a solvency paragraph?
I think that would be sort of okay. So, like, my personal opinion is that I don't think this would necessarily be topical on the AF. Like, if you were thinking about this as an AF, because the resolution specifically says you must require it to workers. There isn't, and usually people will run the argument that resolved means immediate. So, that would be weird to win as an AF. I do think you could run some sort of delay counterplan on the neg. So, this basically says that we don't implement the affirmative immediately. And then, yes, this could function as a counterplan. the net benefit might be a little weird to win, but I'm assuming it would just be something like, because like it's weird to phrase that, like obviously the argument is like, oh, people will just kind of like, I guess I'm confused about what would be the net benefit of implementing something like that.
I feel like honestly, I'm just trying to make it confusing. But basically what I'm trying to say is that I can also run this on the neg. I feel like it could theoretically be a K also, and say like I'm agreeing with the resolution, quote unquote, but I'm kind of altering it so that it's not one, it's not an immediate requirement, and two, it's not a requirement for all workers. I'm specking workers that have been trying to, actively get a job and have been under the poverty line for like 1 to 2 years.
Wait, what do you mean by like trying to get like people who are trying to get like above the poverty line? Because I guess my confusion is that like okay, so any worker that isn't achieving a living wage currently would technically fall under this definition of trying to achieve a living wage because they have a job insofar as a living wage only is only available to those who are already working. So
Yeah.
then I guess I feel like you might need a more tangible net benefit to kind of delaying this.
Okay.
Because
I
otherwise you won't be able to win the counter plan. You need a reason why it's like better, I guess.
okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
otherwise it'll probably lose to like a perm or just like there's if there's no net benefit, just do the app. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello. Quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking of running a neg argument that's basically stating that individuals who are earning like a higher wage, these companies are gonna be giving them less hours, and this is negative because they can get on social welfare so that some of them require them to be working. So it's actually gonna be a dual negative effect. How do you think that would work? Or is it like
Yeah, I think that sounds a little bit similar to kind of the trade-off dissent that I was mentioning earlier. I'm not sure exactly you can also clarify like if this may or may not be exactly what you're talking about. But the trade-off dissent is functionally like are you talking about how when the government implements the living wage that they are no longer willing to fund these kind of welfare programs? What were you saying about like the less
okay,
hours?
so some welfare systems require you to be working and actively like a set number of hours. And then these individuals, once they get on the living wages increase, it's shown that they're gonna get less hours. They're gonna be less hours and less consistently on a consistent schedule. So they get less time to actually work, so they can't actually meet the requirement for those like systems, government systems.
Okay. Yeah, I think that definitely could be potentially like another link it could be another internal link for the trade-off disad. I honestly think that could work, but also, I think there's also the question of just like, would requirements for these welfare programs stay the same if the government implements a living wage, or would that also just like change the way that these welfare programs like qualifications, eligibility are like function in the first place? And also potentially, hold on, there was one other thing I was gonna say. Yeah, I think wait, actually, Mira, did you want to add anything? I fully like lost my train of thought for a
Yeah,
second.
I think just one of the things you want to make sure you keep in mind is what is the benefit of welfare programs post the implementation of the affirmative? Like, I think this is similar to what Felicity was saying, but it's like if your living wage provides you with food, education, water, etc., housing, what are the need of the welfare program? So it's like, yes, it could have a trade-off implication, and I do think that could be like a turn to the affirmative and be like, hey, you don't actually solve poverty and you actually make it worse. But
Mhm.
you also need to consider whether the welfare programs are needed.
Yeah, I think,
Okay.
yeah, that's actually what I was gonna say too. Like, even if they're working less hours, like potentially that's like a good thing because they're still able to like function the living wage, like the purpose of the living wage is the same, if not like to cover more than the existing welfare programs. So the fact that you like have to work less hours to do that is probably honestly a good thing.
What should I add onto it to have like a stronger offense? Like,
Um,
like
I think it could. Are you planning on like reading this as like a disad against, or I guess first, what were you thinking would be like the impact of the disad? Was it just like Like,
Just like saying this doesn't solve the underlying problem of poverty, and these systems are gonna continue happening. These
okay,
individuals are gonna receive less benefits. I was gonna talk about how welfare systems are much more effective than just giving people money, and how
okay.
this could help out like communities and all that.
So I think in that case, I think what's most strategic is that you should read a counterplan about an advantage counterplan that says like instead of doing the living wage, we should do a specific form of welfare. I think the issue with what you were describing earlier is that it's a form of defense, not offense, because when the
Hmm.
neg is just saying like you can't resolve these underlying structures, that's not actively a reason that you should prefer the neg side. That's just a reason that the app like may not be the best, but then the app can just go for example, like try or die framing, saying like, oh, a risk that we are able to make things better for these like current welfare recipients means that you should affirm. So if you, but the strategic advantage of reading a counterplan would be like you have to have an independent reason why living wage actively trades off and is harmful for like or I guess yeah, you would have to say like instead we should actively do welfare programs, and doing the AF makes it impossible for us to do these welfare programs which are better because of XYZ reason.
Okay, thank you.
Would also be benefited by looking into the unemployment dissad. I think the unemployment dissad is super strategic, and instead of talking about welfare programs, you could just talk about the fact that like, oh, like people are gonna be like fired, and that's gonna make poverty worse. That's just
Hmm.
an additional argument that I think would work really well with what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Let's look at the chat. So, Felicity, this first question is about the FemK. But it says, how would you approach defining the living wage and implementation on a second shift KF, and would the government have to pay those women?
Yeah, I think I had two thoughts about this. The first is that I think it would depend on whether you can find a definition of I would say that you'd probably be looking for a definition of the word worker that is more critical. You're definitely not going to be using like the conventional worker is like someone who's like in a legally binding contract with their employer type definition. If you can find a worker definition that is more critical and specific to woman and like care work type stuff, then I think that could work. But otherwise, I think, to be honest, the second thing that I was thinking is that potentially it would be better just as like a slightly non-topical, if not entirely non-topical, KF, where you just don't defend that and you say that because women are excluded from the mainstream notions, definitions of worker in the first place, that it's impossible for you to like, or you shouldn't be forcing us to defend the resolution because it simply just like cannot account for that. But I think obviously if there does exist a definition that says that women are that like there does exist a critical definition for women being included, then that would make the TVA really strong. And in that case, you should just read like a topical version. Yeah, that article definitely would then be really good for, you can just use that as the definition for a topical KF then.
Yeah, and also I know your question was talking about like defining a living wage. I low-key think this would be more of like a mindset shift. I don't really know how, like a lot of times fem apps will make more of a mindset shift of like how they embrace like the economics, because I do think it would be weird for you to make like a material implementation like, oh, the government like pays you for working at home or something like that. Felicity, I know you've read more into feminist economics and stuff like that, but I do think it would be more like less of a material K.
Yeah, I agree. I think the main issue with the topical FEMAF on this topic is like, you probably aren't addressing the underlying logics that like feminist critiques talk about like care work, because the whole point is that yes, care work isn't like or care work meaning like I guess the labor that isn't like conventional labor is not being compensated in the status quo. But feminist economics or just feminist theories in general don't always say that the solution is to then pay women for what they're doing. They think that instead we should value it in other ways that aren't focused on these logics of commodification, on like adding like a monetary label to this kind of care work, if that makes sense. So you can think about it a little bit. There's like a lot of overlap with the CAPK actually. That yeah, I think makes it probably still more strategic overall as like a if you want to go like really into the feminist theory part of it, then it would definitely be better as a non-topical app. But if you're just doing like soft left type, like gender inequality or like structural violence type thing, then yeah, it would work as a topical app.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question, yeah, of course. Okay, so the next question from Allison, for the wealth link for set call and the link for cap about how wages are commodification of worker, how do you beat back the argument that these are just links to status quo? A couple things. One, I do think that like the whole like conception of workers is a better link to make because the idea of who a worker is bad. But obviously that is also a status quo link. So I think in general, first in any critique, a lot of times the links are to the status quo, but it's the idea that the affirmative defends the resolution and the conception of resolution as good, which is a bad thing. Like you're making a link, like you can make a link to the resolution and make a link to how, our conception of wages are bad. Okay, that's why the CAP-K, the alternative communism, doesn't have the same conception of wages. In communism, like Marx is like all the way, like if you kind of think about Marx's late stage of communism, he basically says that you don't have wages at all. And if you do have wages, they're completely redefined. In terms of Sakal, I think the idea, like, there would be just a refusal of a settler's conception of wages in the first place. So the link would just be to the fact that, like, okay, your conception of it is inherently bad. If you look back to the right to housing topic, this is similar to, like, our conception of housing is bad. We should kind of change that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to quickly add, like Meera was saying, it's basically like, yes, we can acknowledge that these structures exist in the status quo, but what we're critiquing is that the AF is actively investing more in that harmful system instead of doing the alt, instead of like divesting from that structure or system completely.
Yes, the Ks can be run on the AF or neg. You could run a KAF. So that's where you kind of, so there are two methods. So first of all, there's a soft left AF. People consider this a KAF. By definition, it is not a KAF, but soft left AF is rather than, your classic util extinction scenarios, you talk about structural violence and how we need to focus on certain marginalized groups of individuals. Second, there's critical apps. They critique the topic as a premise and they don't defend the topic. For example, I might have a cap app and be like, yo, you telling us to defend a living wage is bad because wages are bad and the living wage sucks. And you're forcing me to be a capitalist. And that in itself is bad for education. Thus, I shouldn't have to defend the resolution. I'm going to defend a communist transition. And then that would be my advocacy. Yes, it's cheating. That's why people will read topicality.
It's not cheating, Meera. It's not cheating. If you can win,
yes, no one quote me on this because I do read non-topical apps. So
yeah, so do I.
But yeah. Yes, people read topicality about against this and say it is not allowed. But yeah, on the neg primarily is where you see the critiques. You see things like the CAP-K, which is like the AF is capitalist, we should be communist, or the settler colonialism critique. The AF is colonialist, we should refuse this. Okay, cool. I'm glad that makes sense. Let us know.
I promise. Okay, I'm very, very quick tangent. If you guys have questions though, like fully just cut me off from my tangent. But I was like very opposed to non-topical KAFs before I went to camp with Meera this summer, and then we both went to NSD and got like really, really into non-topical apps. So yeah, it's not cheating, guys. Non-topical KAFs are good.
Real.
The T framework is also good.
Okay. Any other questions? Didn't you win the camp tour?
No, I didn't. I got second. Also, who are you? Samir.
How is
It's
a non-TF not cheating? Bro, because being capitalist is so much okay.
Also,
Loki,
wait, no, cheating is good because the framework is bad.
Okay, because you saying I'm cheating is low-key capitalist. No, I think the conception of cheating is capitalist. You're forcing me to be part of a bourgeoisie. You're welcome. No,
Oh,
the
Samir, it's
conception of
not
cheating.
cheating.
What is cheating, Samir? Unique education? Yeah, it's like it's basically says like the negative just okay, so like the justification for being non-topical is like the educational benefits gained by the norm enforced by the AF is better than any kind of like fairness lost versus the justification for T is that like you can run whatever you want, which is bad. Yo, ruling class is not good. I don't know where you're getting that from. What is this? But I hope that makes more sense about the justification of education. Do you have resources about running Ks? Okay. I'd say there's this website called Circuit Debater. Yeah, it's called circuitdebater.com or something like that. It is a wonderful resource, honestly, where I've learned like half the stuff. Second, I think there are videos. Debate Drills has published some videos on YouTube about the basic structure of critiques. So have a couple other organizations. If you want to send me your email in the chat, I can like email you a bunch of like resources where you can learn about Ks. Also, watching rounds online would be great. Mayor Contra, you did not forget what T framework was. You are a liar. Bruh, no one deleted your Oh, this other person who gave me your email, do you also want K resources or general resources or bruh? Zoom research. Okay, cool. Perfect. I will send them a little bit after this meeting.
Samir, that's not true. You also have to prep out like every other K and also like
Samir, you know I have to prep out cap good. Do you know how hard it is?
tricks. Also, yeah.
Yeah.
Cap good is actually, yeah, you do have to prep out cap good.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I'm interested in doing like K debate. How do I argue like communism good and needs to be implemented in like a very traditional circuit or like in a very like conservative circuit?
Um,
Because I live in Oklahoma and I really want to run it.
are you okay?
Yeah.
Are you gonna, is this like parent judges?
Not parent judges, but like still like right leaning,
Are they
you
gonna
know?
be voting on the like, are you gonna be running like an actual critique? Don't run
Like
it into
yeah, like that's what I want to do, but like I'm not sure if how would I would be able to do that.
And just another question, would you be spreading or would it be like very traditional style debate?
I don't spread that much, but I've spread and I've not spread. So really the spread is doesn't really matter in the circuit.
Okay,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
also am not gonna lie. I think you can try if you really want to. I
Hmm.
genuinely don't know on a local circuit how receptive like local judges are going to be to that kind of stuff. Like even sometimes like if even like extinction type impacts, also because the cap K does rely on like a lot of cap unsustainable to generate offense, like cap causes extinction.
Hmm.
That part is already pretty hard to win, and then getting parent or lay or other judges to kind of understand like how the alt functions, what the alt is, and why voting neg is like a communist revolution and what that even entails.
Yeah.
Be potentially concerning on the local circuit. But I mean, I guess if you want to go for it, like go ahead.
Yeah. Or I can
I'm
just
not
wait until I go
guaranteeing
to
that it will be
TOC. I'm
great.
gonna go to TOC this December for the first time, so I can just wait until then.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I just the chat is a little funky. But okay, so I would look in okay, so you're saying you're going to this December you're going to like TOC digital question mark?
TOC in Austin, Texas. There's a TOC like tournament in Austin, December, and my team
Okay.
is gonna go there. My first TOC
Okay.
tournament.
So if you do have like if you have like I think that means you're gonna have like progressive judges. I think you could
Hmm.
definitely run the CapK. I would suggest looking into a protracted people's war. This is
Hmm.
one of Mao's kind of like literature, and it basically talks about how we can launch a war. There's three stages, and it's actually there's a very thorough explanation of how exactly we would launch this war. I'm gonna type the author into the chat. Paul. He basically writes about how we can launch a war and become communist. So this will be able to like guarantee your solvency for launching this communist revolution. The second thing you want to look into is that you just have to understand the way capitalism works. So I would watch like things on YouTube, or you could just read books about capitalism inherently being bad or communism being good, and you can learn a lot of like just inherence of why communism is able to solve back for a lot of things. If you can send me your email, I have a note doc about like why capitalism sucks, and I can send
Yeah,
you.
I already sent it with the
Oh
previous
yes, you
K
did.
resources. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll send that. But yeah, you just want to really understand capitalism. A lot of the cards people read are stupid and don't actually make sense. So you just have to be
Mm-hmm.
able to line by line them and explain, like, understand communism.
Okay, thank you. Oh, additional question, if I'm not taking too much time. Um, how would I
Okay.
get like some global impacts? How could I like say that this is going to lead to a global change, like on pro, like because I was like running global arguments.
Like with a topical app?
Yeah,
Like,
just like yeah, with this topical app, just saying that this is going to lead to like either living wage across the world or like some sort of like equivalent benefit.
okay. Yeah, exactly what iPhone 60 says. Which is a spill.
Hey, iPhone 60, what is your name? I'll change your name for you.
Um, But basically, you can make a spillover argument. So, you could basically say that, basically because the US is a global leader and other countries tend to want to compete with it, i.e. China and India, they will also follow US-based regulations. I think this is really strong in terms of, let's say internationally, right? In like the global South, the US starts like raising its wages, right? That means more workers are going to start working for US companies. This then forces international companies in China, India, etc., any other country
Hmm.
that like sources international work to also hire their wages.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Felicity, you need to change iPhone 60's name.
Yes, I did.
Oh, you did?
Yes,
Oh,
I did. You weren't paying
sorry, sorry,
attention,
sorry.
Meera.
I'm sorry. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Perfect. If you guys, I can put my email in the chat. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. You can spam me with stuff. I like debate, so I will be happy to explain. Wow, there's an iPhone 61 now. Very. But yeah, thank you all for attending, and if you have any questions, let me know.
I also put my email in the chat. Feel free to email me as well. Also, yeah. Find us at tournaments, I guess, if you're going to tournaments.
Yes, we will be at Yale. So, see you guys then. Bye.